Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind howled low across the red earth as Declan Zane dropped to one knee, his hat pressed to his chest, and laid the last stone over his brother's grave. The sun was dipping behind the Tetons, gold light casting long shadows over the quiet land. Declan's throat burned. He had not cried, not when he found Elias half dead in the canyon, bullet in his side, blood soaking through his coat. Not when Elias choked out his last breath in the back of the wagon. Not even now, burying him with his bare hands, because the ground was too rocky for a proper spade. But when he looked up and saw her, the woman Elias had promised to marry, standing 20 paces away with dust on her hem, a suitcase in her hand and tears lining her cheeks, something twisted deep and sharp in his chest. "Is it done?" she asked, voice soft as a prayer. Declan nodded. "He's at rest." Verena Moore did not move closer. She stood stiff, like if she took one step more she might fall apart. Her eyes were rimmed red and her lips trembled. She looked smaller than he remembered. She had come west on a stage 3 days ago, expecting to see Elias alive and build a life with him. Now she was alone in a land she did not know, with no man to claim her and no kin to return to. Declan straightened, brushing dust from his knees. He had not spoken much to her before. Just one letter Elias had let him read, how she had been his childhood friend back in Kansas, how their families had planned their marriage since they were 16. Declan had thought it sweet, if a little old-fashioned. But now, looking at her, he felt something else. A pull, a duty. A question he did not yet know how to ask. "You should not be out here alone," he said. "I could say the same for you. I am used to it." She blinked, then turned away, staring out toward the hills. "There is nothing for me here." Declan hesitated. "Where would you go?" Verena let out a breath. "I do not know. Home may be Kansas, I guess, if I can make it back. You cannot travel alone, not now, not with snow coming early this year. I cannot stay here." Declan looked past her toward the cabin he and Elias had built together. It stood quiet and empty now, the chimney cold, the porch sagging a little on the left side. They had planned to fix it together before winter came. Now it was just him. "You will not stay in the bunkhouse with the hands," he said quietly. "You can have the cabin. I will sleep in the barn." Verena turned fast enough to make her skirts whip. "I do not need your charity. It is not charity, it is decency. You were promised to my brother, that makes you." She raised her chin. "That makes me nothing." Declan stepped closer, voice gentle but firm. "It makes you someone I will not leave alone." She stared at him, eyes shining with something like fury and grief. And then, slowly, she nodded. The days that followed passed in slow, cold silence. Declan kept to himself mostly, riding fence lines, checking the cattle, seeing to the hay and feed. He kept his distance, but he watched the smoke rise from the cabin chimney each morning, and he always left wood stacked by her door before sunrise. Verena cooked for herself. He noticed the smell of cornbread once and stew another night. He never asked for a plate. She never offered. But on the 4th evening, when he came back from town with supplies, he found a tin of biscuits wrapped in cloth left on the barn's edge with his name stitched on the corner. He stood there a long while, staring down at her neat handwriting, unsure what to feel. The snow came early, just as he had warned. By the second week of October, the wind curled through the valley with sharp teeth, and the mountains disappeared behind thick clouds. The ranch hands moved on to winter pasture, and Declan stayed behind. Someone had to keep the place from freezing and the cattle from starving. One night, as the cold seeped through the barn walls, Verena knocked on the door. She stood there in her shawl, arms wrapped tight, breath curling in the air. "You will freeze out here," she said. "Come inside." Declan shook his head. "The cabin is yours. You think Elias would want you sleeping in hay while I have a stove and blankets?" He hesitated, then nodded once. They kept to separate rooms. He took the small cot by the fire. She stayed in the bedroom. They barely spoke, but the silence was not sharp anymore. It was tired, worn in. Familiar. One morning he found her outside chopping wood, arms shaking from the weight of the axe. He took it from her without a word, and she let him. Another night, she mended the tear in his coat while he slept, the needlework fine and careful. He started to notice things. The way she hummed to herself when she cooked, the way her fingers trembled when she held her tea, the way she stared into the fire some nights, eyes far away. And one night he asked, "What are you thinking about?" She did not pretend to misunderstand. "I miss him. I know. I keep wondering if I would feel less broken if I had loved him more." Declan looked at her, his voice thick. "You loved him enough." She met his eyes. "Do you think he knew?" Declan nodded. "Yes." They said nothing more. But when she rose to go to bed, she paused, then reached out and touched his hand. Just for a second after that, something shifted. They started talking more, slowly. He learned she liked to read poetry. She learned he had wanted to be a preacher once, before the war. He told her how Elias had saved his life at Shiloh. She told him how Elias had written her letters every month, and how she had read them by lamplight until her eyes ached. They laughed once, over burnt biscuits. And she smiled, really smiled for the first time since she got there. Then came the letter. She opened it by the fire. Declan was fixing the hinge on the window. She went pale. "My uncle wants me to return home," she said. "He says it is improper for me to stay here." Declan looked at her. "Do you want to go?" "I do not know." He stood. "If you want to leave, I will get you there safe, but I will not let you go alone, not after everything." She stared at him, breathing hard. "Why?" He was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "Because I buried my brother and I thought the hardest part was losing him. But it is not. It is watching you walk through this world like your heart is still buried with him." She stepped closer. "Declan, I know I am not the one you planned for, but I am here. And I will not let you leave alone." Her eyes filled. She reached up, touched his face. "I do not want to leave." Declan's hand closed over hers. Neither of them said another word. They just stood there, firelight flickering between them, something deep and quiet blooming in the space where grief had once lived. And outside, the snow fell soft and silent across the land. The creek behind the cabin had begun to freeze in the shallows, thin sheets of silver stretching between stones. Declan broke the ice each morning with a shovel's edge before leading the cows down for water. It was the kind of cold that made a man's bones ache, but he didn't mind much anymore. When he returned to the house, he could hear the quiet shuffle of Verena moving about inside floorboards creaking under her steps, the soft clink of enamelware as she set the table for two. He left his boots by the door and stepped inside, brushing snow from the shoulders of his coat. She was ladling something into bowls, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, steam rising from the pot. "I traded 2 calves for a sack of flour and some dried apples," he said, hanging his coat near the stove. "Old man Harlan said we'll be lucky to get another warm day this side of spring." Verena handed him a bowl without looking up. "Then we'll just have to make do." He took it, nodding. They ate at the table in silence, the warmth of the meal sinking into his chest. She glanced at him once, eyes catching on the scrape across his knuckles. "Fence again?" she asked. "Broken rail near the southern ridgeline. Looks like something heavy came through." She frowned. "Was it wolves? Maybe. Could have been a bull gone restless." After the meal, she cleared the bowls while he gathered his tools. He kept the axe sharpened now, the handle newly wrapped with leather strips she'd stitched together from scraps. He hadn't asked her to. He just came inside one evening and found the handle different, smoother, easier to grip. He was halfway to the barn when her voice stopped him. "Declan." He turned. She stepped out onto the porch, her shawl drawn tight, frost blooming on the hem of her skirt. "Would you take me with you tomorrow?" He studied her for a breath. "South Ridge isn't much to see." "I'd like to walk. I've been in this cabin too long," he nodded once. "Be ready by first light." The next morning she wore a pair of Elias's old boots, too big by half. She'd stuffed them with wool, laced them tight. Declan didn't comment. Instead, he adjusted the stirrup on the spare horse and offered her a hand. The ride to the ridge was quiet. Snow muffled their movements, and the sky stayed low and heavy. When they reached the broken fence, she dismounted carefully, kneeling to trace claw marks in the wood. "Whatever it was strong," she said. "Too strong for a single wolf. Might have been a cougar." She looked toward the trees. "Do they come this close?" "Only when they're hungry." They repaired the fence together, working in easy silence. She handed him nails without being asked, and he passed her the hammer when her fingers grew stiff with cold. When they finished, she leaned against the post, catching her breath. "It feels good to move," she said. "To do something that matters." He watched her rub her hands, her cheeks flushed from the wind. "You've mattered since the day you stepped off that stage." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "I keep thinking about what you said. About not letting me go alone." He shifted, snow crunching beneath his boots. "I meant it." She nodded slowly. "I'm not the same woman who left Kansas. I thought I was coming here to start a life with Elias, but it feels like that life belonged to someone else. You don't have to explain." "I want to." She stepped closer, her breath forming pale wisps between them. "You're not him, but when you're near I don't feel hollow, and I don't know what to do with that." He swallowed hard. "You don't have to do anything. I'll be here whether it changes or not." She reached for his hand, gloved fingers brushing his. "But it is changing." Neither of them spoke for a while. The wind moved through the pines behind them, soft and slow. Then, as if something settled between them, she said, "There's a part of me that still aches for what I lost, but there's another part, and it's tired of mourning." He let her hand rest in his. "Then maybe it's time we built something for that part." They rode back as snow began to fall again, steady and quiet. That night, by unspoken agreement, he set his cot back in the barn. But when he opened the cabin door the next morning, he found her standing there with 2 cups of coffee, one held out to him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He took the cup, their fingers brushing. She looked up, and this time she didn't look away. The wind calmed after the storm, leaving a hush over the valley like the land itself was holding its breath. For the first time in weeks, the sky opened wide and blue, and the sun laid pale gold across the snowbanks. Declan stood at the edge of the corral, mending a splintered rail with slow, measured strikes. His coat hung open, breath rising in faint plumes. Behind him, Verena stepped out of the cabin, one glove in her hand, her other fingers already red from the cold. "You should wear your scarf," he said without turning. "I needed air," she answered, "and a reason to stretch my legs." Declan fit the final nail tight, then leaned back on his heels. "You've got that look." "What look?" "Like your thoughts are louder than the world around you." Verena smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She stepped closer, boots crunching lightly. "I've been thinking about the land grant." He looked over. "The one Elias filed," she nodded. "I found the papers in a tin under the floorboard. He'd made notes in the margins, plans for fencing, a second barn, even a garden. He wanted this place to grow. So did I. Back then, I used to dream about feeding him fresh bread from our own wheat. We'd have a dog, maybe a milk cow. I'd name something foolish." Declan's voice was quiet. "You still can." Verena met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "I've never run a homestead," she said. "You don't need to alone." They both knew it was the first time she'd spoken of staying with more than just her presence. He didn't press. Instead, he wiped his hands and gestured toward the far pasture. "Come with me. I want to show you something." They walked in silence, their boots sinking into the softened snow. He led her past the windbreak where the trees thinned and veered along the creek until they crested a low rise. Beyond it, the land opened wide, a field untouched by fence or plow. Tall grass poked through the snow in places, golden and dry. "This spot's always been my favorite come spring," Declan said. "The wild rye comes in thick. There's a cottonwood that blooms right along the bank." Verena stepped forward, her eyes sweeping the land. "It feels like a beginning. I thought it might be a place for the garden if you wanted." She turned to face him, the wind tugging at her skirt. "You're not asking me to stay out of pity, no. Not because Elias would have wanted it, no." She took a breath. "Then why?" Declan didn't look away. "Because when you walk through the snow, I watch your footprints like they mean something. Because I sleep easier knowing you're near. Because I don't want to imagine this place without your hand in it." Verena's voice was soft. "I thought I'd come here to marry one man. But every day since you buried him, you've built something steadier than any promise we made." "I'm not asking for your heart today," Declan said. "But I'll carry it careful if you ever do give it." She stepped close enough that he could see the bits of hay still clinging to the edge of her sleeve. "I think I started giving it the night you offered me the barn and didn't ask for anything in return." He didn't speak. He just reached for her hand, held it without urgency, their fingers settling like they'd always meant to find each other. That night, she didn't knock on the barn door. Instead, she set 2 plates on the table again and without a word, unrolled a quilt over the cot near the hearth. "You'll sleep warmer in here," she said, not looking at him. Declan stood in the doorway for a long moment before coming in. He hung his coat, set his rifle by the frame, and sat across from her. She poured coffee, her fingers steady. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said. He considered. "When the war ended, I didn't go home. I wandered. For almost a year, I didn't sleep indoors once. I was afraid of waking up in a place that didn't remember me." Verena nodded slowly. "I used to press dried violets into my diary. I thought if I kept them whole, nothing else would fall apart." They sat in the hush that followed, the fire crackling low. "You're not wandering anymore," she said. "No," Declan answered. "I'm not." She rose then, moved to the door of her room. Her hand lingered on the frame. "I'll leave it open," she said. And when she vanished into the shadows, the space she left behind felt less like absence and more like a promise waiting to be kept. The thaw came slow, creeping in beneath the snowbanks like a secret. By early March, the drifts had softened to slush, and thin fingers of green pushed up through the black soil near the creek. The days stretched longer, but the wind still carried the bite of winter. Declan stepped into the yard with a pail of ash and scattered it over the hardened ruts near the well, careful not to slip. He glanced toward the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney in a steady line. Inside, Verena was sewing curtains for the east-facing window she'd mentioned how the morning glare woke her too early now. She'd asked for fabric, and he'd brought back a bolt of faded calico from the trading post. She hadn't thanked him with words, just ran her hand over the cloth and got to work. The ranch felt changed, though nothing had been said aloud. She moved through it like someone who belonged now, not like a guest. When she took the ledger from the shelf and started tallying feed costs against calf births, he hadn't stopped her. When she told him the fencing along the north line needed redone before the ground got too soft, he'd only nodded. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the slope, she came out holding a lidded tin, her shawl pinned at the throat. "I made gingerbread," she said. It's not what I meant to make, but the molasses was nearly gone. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed. You didn't have to, I know, but I wanted to. She handed him a piece wrapped in cloth. He broke off a corner and chewed, watching the way the wind tugged loose strands of her hair from behind her ears. "You been thinking about writing back to your uncle?" he asked, her lips pressed together. "I did, 3 days ago. What you tell him? That I wasn't returning to Kansas. That I'd found work and shelter and I was safe." He studied her face. Was that the truth? I suppose it wasn't a lie. They stood quiet for a moment, the air between them filled with the scent of ginger and wood smoke. "I got a letter too," he said. "This morning." She turned to him, eyebrows lifting just slightly, from a man in Laramie. "Elias owed him money for a wagon team, said he'd hold me accountable for the debt." Verena's mouth tightened. "How much?" "Too much to send by post, but I'll ride out next week." "Settle it." She folded her arms. "You shouldn't carry his burdens alone. Elias made those decisions. He was my brother. He was going to be my husband." Declan looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. "I have some of the savings I brought west," she said. "Not much, but enough to help." "I won't take that. I'm offering, not asking." He hesitated. "You sure?" "I'm sure. If we're building something together, then we bear the weight together." "You think that's what we're doing?" he asked, voice low. She didn't look away. "I hope so." The wind picked up, stirring the dry grass. He reached for her hand, palms rough against her skin. She didn't flinch. "I've been waiting for you to say something like that," he said. "I know." He let out a breath, slow and careful. "When I get back from Laramie, I want to take you to town." She blinked. "Why?" "There's a magistrate there. I want to make it legal." Verena's eyes didn't widen. They softened. "You sure about that?" "I've never been more sure of anything." She stepped closer, her fingers tightening around his. "Then I'll sew a proper dress." He smiled, small and quiet. "Make it blue. That color suits you." She nodded. "And when the thaw finishes, we'll plant that garden together." The sky above them deepened to indigo, the last light of dusk settling on the fields. She leaned into his side, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, grounding them both to the earth beneath their feet. Neither of them spoke again that night, but the fire in the hearth burned long and steady, and the silence between them no longer held grief. It held promise. The road to Laramie had thawed into deep ruts and dark puddles by the time Declan tightened the saddle cinch and packed a week's worth of jerky, oats, and coffee into his bedroll. Verena stood by the barn, her hands tucked into the pocket of her long coat. It was early, the light still blue and pale, but birds were beginning to return to the cottonwoods, and their songs cut through the crisp air. "You'll need to stop before sundown," she said. "That stretch past Rock Hollow gets slick when it warms. I'll take the Ridge Trail. It runs drier." She looked down at the toes of her boots. "I stitched the lining of your coat, right side. It was pulling at the seam." He studied her face, saw how her eyes never lifted. "I'll be back in 5 days," he said. She nodded, but her shoulders didn't ease. He stepped closer, cupped her jaw with a hand still rough from hammer and frost. "Don't doubt me." "I don't," she said, voice steady, "but I've had enough of goodbyes. This one ends different." He kissed her once, slow and sure, then mounted and turned down the trail without looking back. He knew if he did, he wouldn't leave. The ride passed without trouble. He paid Elias's debt in full, handed over the last of the calf money and a promise that he'd not be inheriting any more of his brother's ledger. The man didn't argue. He had Elias's signature in his pocket and Declan's word now beside it. That was enough. He returned on the 5th morning, just as the sun cracked over the ridge. The house was warm with baking heat and the scent of lye soap. He stepped inside to find Verena at the table, needle in hand, working a hem with such precision she didn't look up right away. "You're home," she said when she finally did. "I told you I would be." She rose, and they didn't speak again for a long while. She simply folded into his arms, her cheek against his chest, and he held her like she was the only anchor left in a world still spinning. That Sunday, they rode to town. Verena wore the blue calico she'd sewn with her own hands, a cream ribbon at her throat. Declan wore the coat she had mended, and his boots shined from fresh oil. They stopped at the small clapboard courthouse, where the magistrate led them through the vows without pomp. No one else stood witness but the clerk, who looked more interested in his sandwich than their union. But when she placed her hand in Declan's and repeated the words, her voice didn't waver and neither did his. Afterward, they shared a quiet meal at the boarding house kitchen. He ordered coffee and fried salt pork. She picked at a biscuit with honey. Every few moments, she looked at his hands. "You always do that when you're thinking," he said. "What's that?" "Stare at my hands. I like the way they move, like you're always building something even when you're still." He reached across the table, took her fingers in his. "I am." They rode home in silence, but it was a full silence, one that didn't need filling. The ranch came into view just before dusk. Smoke curled from the chimney, but this time it was their chimney. The fences were still crooked in places, and one of the eaves hung low, but the barn was dry, the water barrel full, and the earth was softening toward spring. She unlocked the front door with the iron key he'd placed in her palm that morning. He followed, setting his hat on the hook just inside. "There's a letter on the table," she said. "From your sister in Missouri." He opened it, scanned the script, his brow creased. "She's sending the old spinning wheel, said it belonged to Ma once." Verena leaned into the doorway. "Do you know how to use it?" "No." "Then I suppose we'll learn together." The next weeks passed with the rhythm of shared work and quiet joy. They tilled a garden on the east side of the cabin, where the sun reached earliest. She planted beans and squash, a little row of onions and a patch of rosemary behind the window. He built a wooden fence around it, not to keep deer out, but because she liked the way it framed the space, like a promise drawn in cedar. The calves came early and healthy. Each night, they ate by lamplight and read from the tattered books Elias had left behind. Verena found one of Whitman's tucked between the floorboards, and she read it aloud, her voice low, her feet curled beneath her on the settee. One night, as the fire burned low and the air turned thick with the scent of earth and oil soap, Declan rested his hand on the curve of her belly. "You've been quiet," he said. "I've been thinking," she replied. About what kind of mother I'll be." His hand stilled, then moved in slow circles. "The kind who kneels in the dirt for beans and still bakes bread before dawn. The kind who gives more than she ever takes." She looked at him, eyes bright. "And you?" "I'll teach him how to hold a hammer straight, or her." Verena's hand covered his. "Either way, they'll never doubt they were wanted." He kissed her then, not out of need, but out of a fullness that had nowhere else to go. Spring deepened. The cottonwoods leafed out and the field behind the creek turned green. They built a new chicken coop, painted it white. Declan carved her name into a plank above the door, and she laughed so hard she dropped the paintbrush. By the time the lilacs bloomed, the baby had begun to move. Verena woke him one night with her hand on his, guiding him to the flutter just beneath her ribs. He didn't speak, just laid there beside her, the fire throwing shadows across the wall, and felt the life they'd made shift beneath his palm. The land still held hardship. Fences broke, storms came, animals sickened. But they endured, not because they had to, because they wanted to, together. And when summer rose up hard and bright, and the baby came under a harvest moon, healthy and loud, Declan held Verena's hand and whispered thanks to a world that had once taken everything, and somehow still given this back. They named her Rose. She had Verena's eyes and Declan's steadiness. She slept best with the sound of the wind through the cottonwood, and her mother's heartbeat beneath her ear. And in the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the fields glowed gold with the promise of another day, Declan sat on the porch with Verena beside him, the baby tucked safe against her chest, and watched the life they'd built stretch out before them. Nothing perfect, nothing easy, but wholly theirs and full.